just another story of the same. You know, we're having a good time. But look at y'all. Just be respectful, dudes, and never learn. I get to work with black women, and you don't. Welcome back to another episode of the Baltimore Bureau Podcast Show. Thanks for joining us. I'm Eze Jackson. I am joined by my lovely co-host, Dr. Khalilah M. Harris, Esquire, this morning. And we have a very special guest host this morning. My good friend Caryn York is in the building.
Hi.
Caryn York is the Executive Director of the Job Opportunities Task Force. Very happy to have you here.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Before we get started, I just want to get into upcoming events. Tomorrow here in Baltimore, there's the Rise for Climate, Jobs, and Justice, which is a national movement that's going on. The Baltimore Actions, a national movement of actions about climate, jobs, and the Baltimore version is the Festival for Change, Climate, Jobs, and Justice, tomorrow at the War Memorial Plaza at noon. Here at The Real News, we have 3 events coming up. Thursday, September 27th, is the Future of Education Town Hall Part 2, a community conversation about the future of education in Maryland with students, parents, educators, scholars, and advocates, hosted by Khalilah Harris.
Ow!
And then Tuesday, September 25th, there's the Freedom Summer, activating and mobilizing communities then and now, a cross-generational conversation with Eddie Conway, Charlie Cobb, and Christina Duncan Evans. The 3 of them will discuss the differences and similarities of activism and mobilizing communities from 1964 to present day, illustrated by the award-winning documentary Freedom Summer. These events are free and open to the public here at The Real News. You are welcome to come. Also on October 24th, we have the next edition of The Whole Bushel, which is my show that I host. The Whole Bushel Live is now happening at Ida B's table. This month, we are featuring Rufus Roundtree and the Be More Brass Factory.
City Forever.
And the lovely Kiki Martin. Yeah, she better shout out City.
City Forever, Rufus. Y'all are a cult.
Yeah, Rufus Roundtree and Kiki Martin will be our guests on October 24th. So come check out Eventbrite to get tickets. It's crabs, it's artist talks, and live entertainment. You do not want to miss it. Well worth being there. Caryn, what's going on in your world right now?
Oh, good. Personal or professional?
No, well, professional. We can talk personal offline.
Tell us the tea. Who are we seeing today? Give us the scoop.
Yeah. So today, it's Friday.
Way to transition.
Friday. I know. Did you notice the elevation in the octave of the voice?
Very much.
Got a little deep just now.
Well done.
Today, Friday, end of the week. I actually, this month, the end of, we're in September now.
We are.
Yeah, we are in September.
Goodness.
It's Virgo season, by the way.
It's Virgo season. Lord Jesus.
Hey,
well, I'm
Virgos.
Scorpio. I'm Team Scorpio, so I can't wait until November.
And Team Sagittarius is looking forward to the end of Virgo season.
Okay. All right. Okay.
Okay, somebody out there doesn't care right
yes,
now. What's
at
going on?
At all. So what's going on is at JOTF, we just moved into a new office right at Charles and Lexington. And so now we're ready to rock and roll. We are looking towards the 2019 legislative session. The Maryland General Assembly, as we know, is on track to look drastically different.
Quite.
Looking
Especially
at the primary.
in our delegation.
Absolutely. From the primary elections, looking at we're a statewide organization, but we're based in Baltimore City. Our main constituency tends to be Baltimore City. So we pay attention to certain entities that interact with the General Assembly, particularly the Baltimore City delegation, the senators and delegates that represent Baltimore City, and certain committees like the Judiciary Committee, the House Judiciary Committee, the Senate Judicial Proceedings Committee, the money committees, because budgets are policy priorities as well. And then, of course, keeping an eye out on the big seat in the State House, the gubernatorial election. We are nonpartisan. We do not endorse. We do not take positions. But our issues are our issues, and we are focused and remain focused on the people. And when we tend to focus on party politics, our people and our issues get caught in the middle. And so whether you're black, white, Democrat, or Republican, if you are about Green Party, thank you for that. You better check it. Whatever your party affiliation, absolutely, whatever your party affiliation, your gender, your race, whatever, If you are about eliminating those barriers that prevent an individual from being able to secure and maintain employment, then we, Job Opportunities Task Force, are ready to work with you in the General Assembly, whether it be in Annapolis, whether it be City Hall, or whether it be in any of the local municipalities across the state. We also run a pre-apprenticeship construction training program, Project Jumpstart, where we have just enrolled our 1,000th individual. This is carpentry, electrical, and plumbing. We're about to come up on our 50th class. And so one of the things that I'm focused on a lot of times when we talk about workforce development, now to be clear, in our communities, folks, the jobs are here and they're coming, okay? There's been a lot of economic development, a lot of investment in the city, whether you like to believe it or not. So the jobs are here. The problem is our folks cannot access the jobs, whether it's a result of them having a high school diploma or lack thereof, bachelor's or associates, some type of occupational license. We got barriers that's holding our folks back. And so many times you have programs out here that will apply for grant monies, and they're the very criteria that they use to determine who's going to be in the program that will, you know, supposedly put you into a job is actually a barrier. And so something like a high school diploma, we don't want that to necessarily be a barrier. So how do we start to not eliminate that as a criteria for the program, but how do we ensure that we're also getting as many people as possible, as many adults as possible connected with opportunities to secure their high school diploma at the same time as skilling up and getting into those job opportunities, because our folks need jobs like yesterday. So that's what I'm focused on, jobs on a more tangible level in the city and across the state, but then also looking to Annapolis for 2019 because I'm scared.
Yeah. Well, I think you are doing an amazing job. You always do. I think you are one of the people, like last week we had Ricara Jones on, and especially during the legislative session, I think it's awesome the more and more we hear from y'all. Because, you know, and I think this probably for people watching and listening, and a lot of state capitals is probably like this. You know, you have your state capital, and it's like away from the city, you know what I mean? It's away from everything.
Purposefully.
And these things happen. A lot of things go down behind closed doors. And we're out here, you know, living our everyday lives, you know, kind of like just trying to make it every day. And it's good to get that information from you in plain language. So, you know, so I appreciate you coming on, and I encourage you to keep that up because we need it.
And I appreciate you all even providing a medium for this to occur. I think it's important for those in media, for those in journalism, for those who have different mechanisms or mediums to allow our voices to be elevated in a way that connects to the community, because our communities, they know what's going on. So this, you know, this idea that our policymakers have that our communities are disconnected from the political and the policy process, they know what's going on. But when you have mediums like what you two are doing here at Real News Network, it allows that connection to be more intentional, to be more effective, and it allows the accountability that's necessary for our policymakers. So kudos to you guys. Mad props.
See, she said it.
Mad props.
We heard it here.
We didn't even pay her.
Mad props.
I mean, you know, our work is based in and embedded in the concept that the future depends on knowing. And I love what you just said about the work that you're looking towards in the legislative session, and that broadly Job Opportunity Task Force is doing, not only to provide some immediate solutions to put people to work, but also to make sure people don't have criteria reduced for them, right? Not that they're given a pass from the things that help them to live their best lives and to be prepared, but instead to also get them access to those things that they may have been missed out of through gaps in opportunities. So I love, you know, how those two things dovetail with one another. And, you know, a lot of what you're talking about is school related. You know, we saw this week 65 Baltimore City public schools had to close as a result of a lack of air conditioning. Why don't we jump off with watching the first story here? Take a look.
On Tuesday, September 4th, sweltering heat forced 65 Baltimore City and 10 more county schools to close early on the first day of the school year due to a lack of air conditioning. This prompted a group of students at Baltimore City College High to hold a press conference and protest the conditions they said were unfit for learning.
It was very uncomfortable trying to learn in these kind of conditions because it's very hot and I was sweating and everybody else, and it's very difficult to concentrate on the content that you're being taught when you're focusing on, you know, how hot it is.
The lack of AC in the winter and cooling in the summer is nothing new for Baltimore school students.
To see my granddaughter at 4 years old go go into a cold school.
The city has by far the oldest school buildings in the state, and the 2012 Jacobs report found that 85% of the city's schools are in, quote, poor condition. Parent advocate Melissa Schober, who serves in the Real News Education Editorial Advisory Board, noted that 34,000, or 41% of students, were affected by the early closures. As the students protested in Baltimore, Governor Hogan held a press conference in Annapolis to blame local officials and a lack of accountability for the lack of working AC.
I think it's outrageous and disgraceful. And, you know, the comptroller and I on the Board of Public Works have been raising this issue for 4 straight years. Dozens and dozens of times with Baltimore County and Baltimore City, only places in the entire state who can't seem to figure out a way to air condition in their schools. We put the funding in, we put pressure on them, we actually tried to penalize them for not doing it.
Throughout his time in office, Hogan has argued schools face a crisis of accountability, not funding, parroting the Koch donor network-backed think tank he served on the board of before running for governor. Students pointed the finger back at Hogan, who's up for re-election this year, saying he has the power to fix the problem.
We demand the governor to send at least a $300 million aid package from the $504 million surplus that he received to help Baltimore City schools get in the adequate facilities in the adequate states that they deserve to be in. We demand more money and we demand justice. We demand to not have to be let out of our schools early because of the inadequate facilities.
The state's own studies have found Maryland needs to spend an additional $3 billion a year to adequately fund its schools. Students pointed to audits in recent years which found no financial irregularities within the school system. Governor Hogan, Mayor Pugh, and other elected officials have pointed to the 21st Century Plan, which aims to build or renovate 28 schools. In August, the city opened 5 new schools. They say the schools not covered in the 21st Century Plan will receive AC units through a 5-year plan launched in 2017 as funds become available. Meanwhile, Hogan's Democratic challenger Ben Jealous blasted the governor for the lack of heating, saying, quote, Hogan is attempting to pass the blame instead of offering solutions. Hogan's office did not respond to a request for comment for the story. From Baltimore, this is Jessel Noor.
Wow, so this is crazy. Last winter, we saw students in schools with coats on in the classrooms. And now the first week of school, we're back with students not even being able to learn in the heat.
Right.
No AC.
Young people looking to, get started, kick off the first week of school, already delayed past Labor Day. That's a new occurrence happening through executive order from the State House here that students are going to not only start school later to boost the economy in some parts of the state, but also that they will start the school year in facilities that frankly show that adults don't have a care for them in the way that they do for their own children.
Is it too much common sense to think that all students should receive the same education, same conditions, same circumstances? Because I'm starting to feel that way. You know what I mean?
Well,
like
I'm
I
even
feel
going
like
to push you.
Huh?
I'm going to push you because this is a misunderstanding many people have. We don't need equality for our kids. We need equity for our kids. So there is a base level where, yes, every child should have access to the books they need, to a proper heating and cooling in their school buildings, high quality educators. But beyond that, we don't even get to equality. Yeah. So how do we get to equity? So I can't even rest with a demand for equality, that all the facilities and all of the resources are the same, because we know in a country built on enslavement and genocide of indigenous peoples that we must look towards equity. And if we start with an equity lens, then I think we can get to equality. But we don't have people even willing to understand the difference between equality and equity. So we get into fights in Annapolis, right, about Baltimore always having its hand out, as if many parts of the state haven't benefited off the backs of the labor and the disenfranchisement of Baltimoreans to their economic benefit. And then they turn back and blame Baltimoreans for showing symptoms of the systems that they're a part of. So,
yeah, for JOTF, we are the Job Opportunities Task Force, and our focus tends to be on employment opportunities for adults. So we don't weigh in many times on issues and challenges related to the K-12 system, at least deeply. But on surface level, there are 2 points that we are very clear and deliberate about raising when it comes to the challenges or whatever opportunities may exist for the K-12 system. The first has to do with the budget. I'm not going to get into, the different allegations and accusations that we may hear every year, but they become more pronounced and more loud every 4 years. I'm not going to get into that political election fodder, but I will say this. Many times when we think about policy priorities, and JOTF, we're an advocacy organization, and we're an advocacy organization because we're clear that what we are seeing today is the result of public policy decisions. We may run a program, but there are tons of issues that our programs cannot fix. Policies will fix it. What we're seeing are the manifestations of these prior public policy decisions. Or the perpetuation of these public policy decisions. Many times when we think about policy, we think of legislation, a bill. We are working very hard, even within our partner community, to get folks to understand that policy also means budget priorities. Right. How you allocate monies and how much you invest in something or lack thereof, you are making a policy decision. You are determining how much that entity or those individuals or those communities mean to you. So when we talk about equality versus equity, it's frustrating because whether we're talking about heating or air conditioning or testing or whatever, there are certain systems in the state of Maryland that, and court cases have shown, right? There's actually findings, okay, that these systems have historically been underfunded. So we're not even at a level playing field yet.
We didn't. That's what I meant. Right. Like we haven't even gotten to equality.
We ain't
much less the equitable allocation.
Okay. So like we got some catching up to do. Like there's some massive investment that's going to mean that investing to bring folks up to speed may mean less for some. That's how it works.
Now I'm gonna push you now. It will not mean less for anybody in one of the richest states in the country.
You are absolutely right.
It is
That's what we say.
Fallacy. You're absolutely right. There is scarcity in the state of Maryland. Or the United States of America. If we go to war tomorrow, we're going to find a couple $1 trillion and go to war. There is not a scarcity.
The money is definitely there.
But it's perpetuated by many folk in Annapolis, even some who are blue column D, that, if we give more to Baltimore, as if somehow it is not an investment in the whole state, then something's being taken away from our constituents. When it's, in fact, the stronger Baltimore is
an investment in the entire state.
In the whole state. Your constituents will have access to so much more, whether it be the ability to go downtown to a field trip and not feel like there may be crime. Because the children in Baltimore are being cared for the way the children in your jurisdiction are being cared for. You won't have to say we're canceling field trips because of ... But there's no scarcity.
But that also feeds into my my second point around when we talk about the challenges when it comes to funding of our K-12 system. We cannot just stop there, because for JOTF, what's frustrating is that those students, however old they are, when they're in the K-12 system, become adult workers. And so when we talk about the different economic development opportunities for the state of Maryland, but particularly in the city of Baltimore, businesses are looking for an educated, skilled workforce. And so if we are talking about things like, oh, we got to get the apprenticeships in the schools earlier, we got to start talking about apprenticeships at 3rd grade. How are they going to focus on apprenticeships if they can't focus on anything because it's too hot or it's too cold? And so when we think about all these challenges, while they may not be on surface level employment related, they are very well going to impact their ability to be able to access and remain in the workforce in the future and be able to move up in the workforce so they can access economic mobility and stability. And so for JOTF, it's not as simple as just, what's going on between the two gubernatorial candidates when it comes to education funding and AC and all of that. We're talking about an entire jurisdiction, an entire city that has historically been underfunded, and it has led to a workforce that has been like today. Okay, when you talk about the workforce of today, one of the key factors that we talk about as a challenge is the disinvestment in our schools. It cannot be ignored. And so we cannot continue to talk in silos when we talk about issues like heating and air conditioning and funding, because it's impacting their ability to succeed later on down the line.
Yeah. This next story kind of continues this a bit, especially when we talk about the gubernatorial race. This is Jezel Noor. Does Hogan's school's rhetoric match his track record? So right now, some Democrats are saying that Larry Hogan is taking credit for the educational accomplishments, but Jezel Noor asks if either candidate, if their policies would be transformational for public schools. So let's take a look at this.
I want to take a minute in support of my important ballot initiative that requires casino revenue to be placed in a lockbox dedicated to education.
Governor Larry Hogan is coming under fire for falsely taking credit for a ballot measure that would ensure casino revenue goes to schools, as was promised a decade ago when Maryland legalized gambling.
This proposal helps us end educational inequality, boost school safety, teachers' salaries, and school construction.
Reports have found that gambling profits, pledged to boost school funding an estimated $500 million a year, didn't actually increase state spending on education. Instead, the increases were diverted to other purposes. In Annapolis, Hogan did introduce his own bill to fix this, but it failed to pass.
Today, we are introducing the Commitment to Education Act of 2018, which will increase education spending by more than $4.4 billion over the next decade by phasing in casino revenues from the Education Trust Fund over the next 4 years.
As we reported earlier this year, legislators backed a proposal to create a ballot measure, arguing this was the only way to prevent future administrations from again diverting the funds.
And the really important part is that I think my bill acknowledges is we establish this fund at the ballot box with the voters. Only the voters can put that lockbox on there. If I just pass a bill that says this money ought to be an enhancement, the governor can take that away the next year.
What Hogan's ad doesn't mention is the governor sets the budget. So for the past 4 years, it was Hogan who failed to give additional funding. The Hogan campaign didn't respond for a request for a comment for the story, but he argues this practice was started by his predecessor, Democratic Governor Martin O'Malley, which is true.
We're already funding our schools at record levels. Passing the lockbox referendum ensures that continues for generations.
It's also true that Hogan has funded schools at their highest levels ever, beyond what is mandated by law. But the state's own studies found that since it froze increases to inflation after the Great Recession, schools have been shortchanged by billions of dollars. Baltimore lost out on over $250 million 1 year alone. The lockbox that McIntosh sponsored would help gradually fix that, phasing in funding over 4 years. But another measure that was defeated this past session would have gone a step further. Delegate Mary Washington proposed immediately restoring the full amount of funding.
This legislation would take effect now. It's not requiring the voters to vote on something that they already voted on. We voted in referenda in 2008 to use gaming dollars to increase school funding. Then we voted again in 2012. So I don't think we don't need to ask the voters again if they want to prioritize public education.
But critics said this measure had the same flaw as Hogan's proposal. It could be circumvented by future laws. They also argued shifting $500 million immediately in the budget would come at the expense of other social services. Meanwhile, Hogan appears to have softened his stance on Baltimore schools in recent public appearances. Before hitting the campaign trail, Hogan frequently claimed Baltimore schools face a crisis of mismanagement, not underfunding.
We cannot allow children to be punished year after year because their adult leaders are failing.
The governor went on to say the problem is not with funding. He says there's enough funding. He says there's not enough accountability.
Meanwhile, Hogan's Democratic opponent, Ben Jealous, has vowed to raise teacher pay, fully fund schools, and expand pre-K to 4-year-olds. Critics say Jealous has yet to articulate how he will fully fund these programs. But Jealous says he can do so by legalizing and taxing marijuana and passing a millionaire's tax on the 1%. Polls show education remains a top priority for Maryland voters, and they will have contrasting visions and approaches to choose from in November. But education advocates say to truly transform Maryland schools, the answer lies in empowering communities.
You need to have a vision of accountability, but to the community in terms of actually producing a framework for educational results that the community finds sufficient, which may include curriculum, may include incorporating local community-based organizations into schools, may include diversity of programming. And that typically isn't talked about in the funding debates. They talk a lot about iPads and air conditioning, and those things are good. But when you're looking at results in a way that actually meets what the community is talking about, the actual parents and the majority, minority, 80-90% of people in Baltimore City public schools are African American, their conversation is a bit different than what the advocates and the politicians are talking about. And I think that that needs to be a central part of the conversation.
So this is a Baltimore conversation that takes place very regularly. I don't think people realize how many everyday people are looking at the building of the casinos. And I have to say, at the time I worked for 1199 SEIU, which, backs a lot of Democrats, we supported the building of the casinos. I personally was reluctant in that support, but I had, I got to follow the machine. You know what I mean? My union is behind this. They're out here promising people the money is going to go to education. Right. But when we were out there and you talk to older Baltimoreans, they were like, we've seen this before with the lottery. Now, we were just talking about, before this, we were talking about the disinvestment in Baltimore City schools, right? This has been going on for decades. Right. And it's like a new...
Both the promises and the bait and switch. Right. Because you said we were going to get the casino money. You gave the casino money, and then you used the money that would have gone to schools for something else. Yep. So there, you supplanted... the existing money instead of giving additional resources. Yeah,
and when I talk about my days of organizing, y'all, as we do this podcast, I'm going to expose little tidbits of how things go down. When we were given the messaging about casino, right, about the casino and jobs, and the money's going to go to schools and all of this stuff, we were not given the history on what happened with the lottery. I found that out once we got in the community and started talking to older black people who were like, we saw this already. Y'all falling for this again?
Supposed to be a revenue stream from the video lottery terminal.
Right. Yep. I mean,
that's what I heard.
So at the time, I was advocating on the side of community with the Transform Baltimore effort. And, had my students wilding out in Annapolis and, sticking it to people, being prepared to answer the question, do the follow-up, demand from people who, as we see sometimes in Baltimore, we like to vote for our friends and don't require our friends to do anything for us. So, they come to an action and they smile and you say, will you sign on to this? And they smile and then you say, will you sign on to this? And then they go and whine afterwards and say, she was mean to me because she wanted me to say I would sign on for kids.
And went on Facebook.
Well, at that time, there was no Facebook popping, but there definitely was blue column D Democrats who were whining in the background that their feet were being held to the fire for kids. And, even within that movement on our side, you had people wanting to demand a penny tax or some other type of tax. Now, sales taxes can be regressive because they, don't work for people who are working folk and don't have millions of dollars. To, they're using money every day to buy their lunch and make sure their kids have what they need.
And in certain communities where the products, the consumer goods, are actually more than in other communities.
Right, because they're paying convenience store prices because they have no groceries and they're in the midst of a food desert or a food swamp. So, quickly it was usurped into this casino thing, and some of the advocates were saying, how do we assure that this money doesn't supplant existing education funds? And for those of you who don't know, there is one mandate in the Maryland Constitution. Article 8 of the Maryland Constitution is the education article. It is the only entitlement in the entire Maryland Constitution. So a real mantra that I would love for people to adopt is that schools should be funded first, right? To say that if we fund schools, we're going to take away from this, or that. My response is, according to the Maryland Constitution, that seems like exactly what you're going to have to do, because it is the only entitlement in the Maryland State Constitution. And we went along and we had local officials saying that, you know, they were going to fund the schools and they supported the schools being funded. And then you have, you know, organizers on the ground saying that, you know, it's going to be jobs, it's going to be money for the schools. And then you have the old heads come back and like, so let me point you back to 1987, where this is exactly what they told us. And then let me point you back to 1963, when people started evacuating the city for the suburbs using mortgages that we couldn't get access to, and the promises that were made about jobs and schools. So, you know, when you see on the other side, on the workforce development side, that you have folk who are eager to provide for their families, eager to be involved in their kids' lives in ways that other families get to, except for the fact that they have to work multiple jobs to stack a livable wage, a wage that they can live on, not just livable. You know, you see how those things come together, and then you hear elected officials time and time again say, why is Baltimore always putting its hand out for more when Baltimore is really asking for some? Yeah. Right? You know, so...
or asking for its due worth.
What was promised?
Right.
What was agreed upon? You know what I mean? Like, the casino brings in big money. You know what I mean? Like, there's big money coming in from these casinos. Right. And there's no reason why our kids should be in unair-conditioned schools and unheated schools with all that money. Like, this, it's ridiculous.
And, absolutely. But, you know, I do also want to make sure that, you know, not in an effort to try to assign any, you know, individual pathologies or whatever, but, you know, as someone who has lived and breathed Annapolis for the last couple of years and has seen how, I've seen how our city delegation interacts with our mayor's team and then with the governor's team, and then seeing how the surrounding jurisdictions respond to Baltimore City. I challenge us all to do a better job of our own messaging and coming together and ensuring that we are actually identifying and supporting opportunities to incorporate best practices and cutting edge processes and mechanisms to best serve our children, who will then become, or who are already, the future of our state in America. Because at the end of the day, it's always going to boil down to, and you see this in other jurisdictions, but particularly in Baltimore City, because it's predominantly African American and it's an urban area. You're always going to have higher scrutiny in terms of how you're spending your money and what you're spending it on.
And in fairness, you know, this is something that I actually love hearing when Britt Kerwin says that it's not only about it's not only about additional money, it's money for what? And for too long, we've seen this constant race to Annapolis for a demand, don't cut the school's budget, don't cut the school's budget, don't cut the school's budget. But, you know, advocates have to do a much stronger job of equipping folk to say, for what, right? Because we want an increase in teachers who are prepared through culturally relevant strategies, because the teaching workforce does not reflect the schools, because our kids don't have access to the computer science courses to prepare them for the future of work, so that if they can get a job based on skills and not necessarily degree or pedigree, they will be able to live their best lives. But those have not been the messages that were coming forward, and I definitely think not only our delegation and city officials, but the people have to rise up and claw back the vision for the city and have a comprehensive vision for economic development, which includes schools.
Absolutely.
So that when we're in Annapolis, people understand, so our families are looking for participation in the future of work in a high-tech economy, therefore we need X, Y, and Z. If you cut those dollars, there's going to be an issue. Not just the money, yes, but for what?
Because we're using this argument, this traditional argument that has been used for the past 50-some years. And we know that the student nor the worker are traditional in any sense.
Right.
Yeah.
And we also know that that argument ain't working in Annapolis, okay? We know that in many of our committees, we're having to go before folks who are making decisions on behalf of the city and are not of and from the city.
Yeah.
And so we have to be able to be a bit more intentionally creative and savvy with our message and making sure that we're connecting it to your investment in the city in terms of giving us what we should have already gotten.
Right.
Will contribute to the economic viability of the state as a whole. And this is why.
And also a lot of these policies that Baltimore is asking for, absent the savvy, causes jurisdictions like those on the Eastern Shore and Western Maryland to feel like Baltimore is trying to hoard when in fact this policy will benefit their constituents directly, right? You talk about recreational marijuana and who's getting licensed to do that. The last I checked, there are huge farms on the Eastern Shore, right? It's not just about making sure that Black and brown folk who have been disproportionately impacted by the criminalization of the use of marijuana have now access to the enterprise of the marijuana industry. But there's some very large Black properties on the Eastern Shore. Your constituency.
I do want to flag. I do got to flag this. So now when we talk about medical marijuana, and I don't. I kind of blocked a little bit of it out because, you know, sometimes you got to block some stuff out of Annapolis.
You got to compartmentalize
in order to be able to move forward with your life. But during the medical marijuana debate, there was a proposal that was put forth by, it was a number of delegates, but I specifically remember, I think maybe Delegate Barron from Prince George's County, I think maybe Mosby from Baltimore City. I think it was some other, it was a number of legislators within the caucus who wanted to ensure that medical marijuana revenues, at least like 2% would go towards Black communities and Black businesses. And there were actual members of the Black caucus who said, well, no, we can't do that because we don't know how much 2% is, and 2% might be too much. So I'm going to just end right there because you kind of black out a little bit because you're like, huh? But
that's your cousins.
No.
I can't claim them.
No.
Okay.
All right. Let's get into this next one. This is a heavy one today, y'all. This is heavy.
We're gonna keep moving.
But this one is hidden victims. Taya Graham and Stephen Janis are doing a series called Hidden Victims: How the American Criminal Justice System Abuses Women of Color. And this week we have one episode up. I want y'all to take a look at this and encourage you to check out the other episodes because this stuff is pretty heavy. Check it out.
Finally, justice has been served after 14 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit.
As a reporter working in Baltimore, questions about the fairness and effectiveness of the criminal justice system are always front and center.
I'm standing outside the Hyatt Hotel where the Fraternal Order of Police is holding a convention.
From the Justice Department report, which found that the Baltimore City Police Department practiced racist and unconstitutional tactics.
The police department made roughly 44% of its stops in two small, predominantly African-American districts that contain only 11% of the city's population.
To the Gun Trace Task Force scandal, the elite unit of 8 officers that robbed residents, dealt drugs, and stole overtime.
In that task force, they conspired to engage in a racketeering conspiracy. The crimes included robbery of victims, overtime fraud, filing of false police reports, and a variety of other illegal activities.
It's clear to anyone that the systemic issues of racial inequality and policing poverty continue to plague Baltimore's criminal justice system.
And they're treating us like animals.
And as a Black woman, I am also acutely aware of how those larger issues of institutional racism and gender bias harm us directly. But it was a scandal at the public housing project called Perkins Homes that made me aware of another problem.
It seems like no one is listening to me. No one is trying to give me information about the problems that I'm having.
While I was investigating complaints of maintenance workers demanding sex for repairs in public housing, I met Tanita Wilson. After spending weeks talking to her about her own experiences, I began to realize that beyond the statistics, the reports, and the politicians, something was being lost.
I was in an uncompromised position. I had to do what I have to do in order to pay that bill. He just stated that we can clear the bill up if you perform a sexual act with me.
The voices of the victims.
Just your presence being here is good enough for me.
The stories of women of color that are rarely told or given equal time. Instead, the narratives almost always focus on the opinions of politicians, police, and experts. And this is how the idea of this series, Hidden Victims, emerged. We decided to talk to women who have suffered at the hands of law enforcement in ways both direct and indirect.
But you already knew that he was deceased. He had already died.
And recount their stories in their entirety to give meaning to the numbers and statistics.
That was the worst experience of my life.
Bothering that is, it clearly looks like a homicide. It smells like a homicide. Like, why wouldn't it be investigated as such?
And most of this series will do what the mainstream media rarely does. Listen.
Every day I think about my sister. Every day.
What would give you that peace?
To know that somebody cared enough to investigate and see what happened to her.
So again, I want to encourage you to check this series out. You can go to therealnews.com/hidden-victims to check these stories out. Many of them pretty heartbreaking stuff, man, and stuff that, I mean, I think this is one of those things that, like, we know happens, but we don't talk about it. So shout out to my colleagues Tia Graham and Stephen Janis for tackling this.
Yeah, I mean, you know, you have the hashtag Say Her Name, and you have intersectional feminists like Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the phrase intersectionality, and others who are, you know, pushing society to see the weight that Black women bear in so many different frameworks. And Caryn, I know you see this in your work, where Black women, and we talk about this in our reporting about the school to prison pipeline and how it manifests for girls differently than boys, just being pushed into human trafficking, being criminalized for things like the shape of their bodies, and how that then continues and perpetuates itself into when you need justice from the criminal justice system, actual justice, and how they then turn you into the criminal, right? How dare you, Black women? You're supposed to be stronger than that. How dare you ask for that kind of help? Or don't talk back to me, or you're going to find yourself with a charge, you know? Or what do you mean I'm not working hard enough to find out who killed your child? Like, all of these stories that we see shows not only a disregard for Black women as sovereign, autonomous, worthy of the constitutional rights that everybody else is worthy of, but this ongoing erasure of them in the face of the expectation that Black women carry the weight and bear the burden of our communities.
Yeah.
So, you know, for me, this topic, it's one that I am I'm working through personally, but also organizationally. Figuring out where and how JOTF can lend its voice, because we're very clear about lanes. And so while we advocate on behalf of broad criminal justice reform as it relates to economic justice, we are very clear that the worker is not monolithic. That means the inmate is not monolithic.
Right.
And so there are going to be specific challenges and specific barriers that are specific to a particular segment of a constituency, and you got to be very clear about what they are to address those challenges. So as a Black female, right, in my own professional space, I have to deal with many of my colleagues. Sometimes they are African American, most times not. Describing my my conversation style or my interactions as aggressive and angry and hostile. And so personally, I have to deal with this, and professionally, I have to deal with this. But when you think about how Black women are, and this extends to Black women as a whole, right? So it's not just Caryn is only hearing this, right? When you think about how this extends to Black women as you know, on a whole, and then you think about them in the criminal justice system, and you have to reconcile that with studies that will come out to say Black girls or Black women are more likely to be more violent. You remember that study from earlier this year? They're more likely to be more violent, and so they're going to be more likely to interact with the criminal justice system. They have to, you know, have more restrictions on them, right? That whole pathology assigned to them. But then you also have reports that show that Black women are paying more in bail premiums than any other, like all other races combined.
I remember talking with you
right?
about this
Like that, it really
yeah.
hit me. It really hit me. When you hear, you know, the fact that in terms of pre-release, right? When you are released from incarceration, there are pre-release centers for men across the state. Pre-release centers provide opportunities for you to be connected with educational services, employment services, mental health, substance, all of these things to help you better integrate into the community. Only one exists in the state of Maryland for women, and that's in Montgomery County, right? And when you talk about the reintegration services that are necessary for women as opposed to men, I dare say and argue, and I know Easy, you're gonna be like, don't pull this whole sexist thing, but I dare argue that many times it's more pronounced for women when they are being released. On one hand, the services both behind the fence and outside the fence are just not the same for men and women. And the challenges are different. So even something simple as we having to pass a law stating that our correctional facilities will provide hygienic, sanitary napkins for women behind the fence, right? Something that should be a no-brainer.
Or that they will not shackle
impregnated women, right? When you know this, and when you know that 4% of our state prison population, you know, is made up of women, when you see nationally how the number of Black women behind the fence have doubled in relation to the number of white women behind the fence, and when you just see how the interactions of our law enforcement, our local
Daniel
law
Holtz
enforcement,
clause,
you know what I mean?
You know, I can rape you, I can do whatever I will with you because you're probably, like, I don't know that you're a sex worker, but you're probably a sex worker. No one's going to believe you.
And then there's that, right? Really, and having to, you know? and I just want to spend a minute on this, because even within the human trafficking community, right, there is contention around who we support. Because if we are saying that the criminal record is a barrier for you moving forward, we mean for the female sex worker too, or even the male sex worker, or the LGBTQ sex worker, okay? Because you're getting charged with trafficking when you are being trafficked. And that's not your only charge. You're getting theft, you're getting trespassing, CDS possession, all of these different things. And if you can't get that record eliminated so that you can get a job, that dependency that on whoever you had it on exists. However, you have people within the human trafficking community who will say, but they're different from, let's say, children who were being trafficked. Or there's a certain face that we want to put on our marketing materials or how we advocate in front of our policymakers in Annapolis and beyond when it comes to who truly needs the most help and support when it comes to trafficking and being trafficked and all of these different criminal justice offenses. And it tends to fall along racial lines. And so that's why I said I'm trying to work through this, because you don't want to automatically just come out and say it, but when you got a DOJ report that's like, when they're doing this, it's opposed to this and this, and then you got these studies that are coming out, and then you're looking at the numbers, and then it's like, what, I mean.
I mean, I love that JOTF has two things that I want to make sure we lift up for people. One, on the ground, JOTF will go into communities and do expungement, resources, legal counseling, GED signups, all of this good stuff, and do it all through the night. All through the night, right? Like, that is, y'all out here on the corners, come and get your record expunged. You know, you out here in these streets, make this happen. So that's one. The second is your recent report on the criminalization of poverty. And how many systems are put in place, including school to prison pipeline, including, you know, who has access to services when they're behind the fence, when they're trying to come home and start again.
They say it's expensive to be broke.
Right? You don't have a bank account, you can't get a loan. You don't have a job, you can't get, you know, startup
they charge
money
at the convenience stores. It's like $3 for a roll of toilet paper.
A single roll.
A single roll.
So,
and then, you know, it was funny.
It
was funny talking to people during the uprising in 2015. I'm a West Baltimore boy, and so you know, we've talked about this before. Like, I was around that time just coming home from my first U.S. tour, and having to explain to people who live in Maryland, not Baltimore City, and in other states, that it was not a community just burning down and tearing down their neighborhood. That these stores have a history of overcharging us,
exploiting the people,
criminalizing us. You know what I mean? Like, you know, you go a few minutes up the street to the county and you're paying $2-3 less for your toilet paper, for your gas, for your soap. You know what I mean? All those things. It's like, these are not our stores.
Right.
And you know what I mean? This is not some. These people
Suspend
are not.
your disbelief. This is not 1963.
Right.
You know,
these stores are not
MLK was
here
not
for
recently
our,
assassinated. It's not 68. They're not burning down their auntie and their uncle's store. They're not raging against
these are
community.
predators.
Right.
Predators.
These are predators. These businesses, the police officers, they're all predators thriving on poor people. You talk about 21215. 21217. Zone 1517. Zone 17, where Sandtown is, where Freddie Gray was killed, where he's from. Lowest median income, highest marijuana arrests. You know what I'm saying? In the city.
And you add in the environmental aspect of highest rates of asthma and lead poisoning.
Right.
You brought up a really, really good point when you talk about the interfation of stats. 2015, right around the time of the uprising, there was also a report that came out called The Right Investment that showed that there were certain communities in Baltimore City that had the highest rates of police involvement and imprisonment, and folks on parole and probation also had the highest levels of unemployment, lowest levels of educational attainment, lowest levels of access to, you know, affordable housing and access to food. And you see it. It's clear as day. And then also, when you're talking about how expensive it is to be poor, and pulling it back to the criminalization of poverty report that I'm happy that you, it's my report. I didn't even mention it. Thank you, Khalilah.
We were gonna get to it.
I know. I'm sorry.
We help each other.
There's something that when JOTF found out about it, we haven't been able to let it go because a lot of people don't realize this. In our communities, we know that the jobs aren't here. You got to travel outside of your community to get it. Our mass transit system, far from perfect. So for many folks, you have to have a car. Unfortunately, the car insurance companies are allowed to use non-driving factors to determine your insurance rates. You got to have insurance to drive, okay? So if you're using things like credit, income, education, occupation, all of these things.
And you've been deprived of all of those things.
You've been deprived of all of these things, yet you have to pay more in insurance versus your whiter counterparts and neighbors that's literally like a couple blocks over, right? You got some options. You got to go to work. So what you going to do? You're driving without insurance. You live in a community that's over-policed and underserved. You getting stopped.
That's it.
Snowball effect.
That cycle. It's things like not you making me pay for something you know I can't pay for. But by law,
then you say
I have
to me,
but
why won't you work?
Yep. And
About
this
the
is there. It's transportation. It's in child support. You know what I mean?
Don't
You got
get me
men.
started.
You're not working. You can't pay your child support. We're gonna suspend your license.
And
you get caught. You get caught pulled over driving with a suspended license. Going to jail. You go to jail. You lose your job. You still can't pay your child support. It is expensive to be broke. It's crazy.
I got some feelings about child support, but
we all do. I know I'm conflicted too. At the
ain't
same
nobody
time,
got more feelings than me.
You know who has feelings?
Shout out to
the
my
children
babies.
who need to eat.
Shout
There
out,
you go.
Shout out to my babies.
Team 3 girls.
Not
Thank
saying
you,
nothing
Easy. We're
else.
going to touch and
Lord
agree
have
on
mercy.
that.
And look, I'm right in the middle because it's like,
Yeah.
y'all, maybe we should have a conversation about child support because I swear to goodness, it's an antiquated system, but it's one where, yes, you want to make sure the support is there for the children.
Yeah.
But the way the system is built right now, the support ain't there for the children the way it should be.
Yeah. It's
And
just
we
a
are
check.
not talking about things like unification like we should. The child support enforcement system doesn't allow for that because y'all got some very real concerns that cannot be ignored and have to be figured out.
Right.
And this is what folks are dealing with.
Yeah, and it's so hard because you have a situation where it is hard to say to a person who is bearing the full brunt of taking care of their child, that the other person responsible for taking care of their child gets a pass because the system is against them.
But is it a pass?
But that's my
giving
point.
them a pass?
That's my point, right? It's hard to say to that person that they get a pass because that's what they hear. Like,
Gotcha.
well,
Okay.
you know, I also have a sentence of 18 years to care for this child. So should I go to jail? Should I just start hustling? If that's the rationale that the system's against us, right? But then the evidence of how the system is against their partner or the person they partner with in having a child, it is so insurmountable in many ways because of the way the child support enforcement system is set up, right? The incentive is not for the child to get what they need because, frankly, there are often times where the child support that is being paid is in no way enough to take care of
Unfortunately,
the baby.
not in my case.
Well,
but
listen.
The money is all going to a good use.
It's going to a good use.
And how do you make sure that the money isn't used in a way where the parents don't even like each other, don't even want to talk to each other? How is that good for the or the lack of money is being paid? That's not good for the child. Like, it's just, but I get it, y'all. That's another one.
It's a whole other topic.
But
I don't even know
that needs to be
how we got here.
Caryn, you could be the mediator.
I want to talk about it.
Because
y'all, people going to jail because they paying for their child support.
Yeah,
Like, people, I mean,
it's
like,
serious.
but also
it's
families struggling because they're not getting the support. We're gonna talk about. Let's just move on.
It's crazy.
And even when you think you pay a lot.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Shout out to my daughter's mother.
Even when you think you pay a lot,
you're doing a wonderful job.
Nowhere near what they need.
And look, mom's having to pay child support too now.
Yeah.
Now you all of a sudden starting to see a lot more women being like, we got to do something about this.
As they should, if they are not the primary caregiver. You better put up that coin, not just because you gave birth to them.
But you should put up coins that also allow you to live as well.
Absolutely.
I mean, everybody got to live.
Yeah.
There's
no point in you struggling because then we're struggling for a lifetime.
And we got to figure out a way to take into account, like, don't y'all.
Okay.
Move on.
Next story.
And I'm not shouting anybody out. So
we do need to cover this one day somehow. There's so much I want to say on this topic, but we do have to move on because we can't. The podcast can't last all day.
Wait, my bank account is set up.
Oh my goodness!
Move some money from my savings to my check.
The last story that we have here. Can environmentalists and labor unions unite? Shout out to our wonderful colleague, Donna Noor, who is in San Francisco or headed to San Francisco. To do some work. She does awesome work on climate change. And
Global Climate March is next week.
Local Climate March is
this week,
Saturday.
This weekend, but out in San Francisco, Global Climate March.
Right.
She'll be covering it along with our colleague, Will Arenas.
Yep.
And bringing us additional stories about environmental justice. But let's check this thing out
this is
now.
great. She brought up some good points with this last week when we were talking to Ricardo Jones, too. But, can environmentalists and labor unions unite?
Should we fight for labor rights or against climate change?
We are putting our great coal miners back to work.
In 50 years, we can't be burning oil, coal, and natural gas.
The number of lives that will be lost because of the damaging impacts of climate change in the hundreds of millions.
Some organizers think we can and must do both.
We know that when we talk about the opportunities that exist around a new clean economy, we are talking about the creation of over 5 million jobs that are estimated by 2040.
At the Baltimore People's Climate Movement's New Energy and Economic Future Town Hall, union organizers and environmentalists examined how coalitions can save jobs and the planet.
When we work in silos and work on a single issue, then it allows you to be accountable in one area, but not accountable in a different area.
Moderated by the Real News Network's Khalilah Harris and Mark Steiner, panelists addressed the challenges with job creation in sustainable industries.
A solar farm and a windmill doesn't really create a lot of jobs after the installation.
A lot of union supporters and union workers are afraid when we talk about closing down a plant or an incinerator because real people work there and real people provide for their families. So how do we transition those people into jobs that help to save our planet?
The average wage in a fossil fuel job is around 35, 36 with benefits. The average wage in the clean energy is around 20, 21.
And explored solutions to those problems.
If we are trying to move into the new energy and economic future, we need to make sure that as we are creating green jobs in a green industry, that we're also creating jobs where workers still can unionize, where workers are still making a living wage.
We should be making those things here in this country and using USA-made solar panels, USA-made steel. And here's something I want you to remember, that a solar panel made in anywhere else in the world is 5 times dirtier than a solar panel made in USA.
They say the fight goes from the classroom.
Is gravity a political issue? No, it's not. It's a fact. And so is climate change. And they teach gravity in their schools.
To City Hall.
We're in a city right now who has a mayor who has an opportunity to utilize a streetlight campaign. We have the opportunity to do solar streetlights.
To the streets.
If you aren't organizing to see something that your grandchildren will see the benefits of, you're not really organizing.
But the narrative that labor and environmentalists are always at odds is pervasive.
There have always been those owners of business and industries who have looked for an opportunity to separate people. They understand that that is a part of the power dynamic.
Former EPA senior advisor and current Hip Hop Caucus senior vice president Mustafa Santiago Ali says this fight is happening across the country.
If you look at places like Appalachia, or if you look at places like Kentucky and West Virginia and Ohio and Pennsylvania, what you will find in that space, especially in West Virginia, is that they have not allowed for newer types of economic opportunities, newer types of businesses in the renewable space to even move into and to be able to effectively compete. So therefore, they are placing a real disservice on the folks who are there in those locations because they won't be able to take advantage of the 5 million new jobs that are going to be created.
Panelist Jim Strong is District 8 Director at the United Steelworkers.
In 2008, the O'Malley administration introduced the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act.
His union initially opposed the bill and it died.
The concern about the bill was the impact that this tax would have on the electricity use at the facility. And they used a lot of electricity, and we were concerned it would have a negative impact on the jobs.
But a coalition of unions, environmental organizations, and government agencies worked together to draft a compromise.
And we actually end up drafting a bill which was passed in 2009.
This doesn't mean labor and environmentalists always agree. For the past 7 years, environmentalists have introduced a bill to end subsidies to a paper mill that burns a byproduct known as black liquor.
That's the second largest employer in Allegheny County.
Nabiha says it can be hard to talk climate change with people who are facing more immediate issues.
People who are, poor, oftentimes unemployed or underemployed, doing the best that they can. And so when you talk to them about an environmental movement, they feel like that's not something that should be a priority.
Even though environmental degradation and climate change disproportionately impact poor people and people of color.
Vulnerabilities that communities experience as a result of injustice only makes climate impacts worse for those communities.
But the People's Climate Movement says they're down for the challenge.
Unions got to where they were by people putting in a lot of hard work. And so the same thing will have to happen with the green jobs industry.
So another one of these complicated subjects, right? Because like I said, we were talking last week, and there's from the union side, of course, they want people working.
Yes, in union jobs.
Mm-hmm. You know, and then you have the whole other important issue of taking care of the environment, climate change, and some of, you know, in some of those areas there are no union jobs.
Right.
Most of those areas there are no union jobs.
Yeah.
So it's a very interesting dichotomy, I think, happening with this.
Mm-hmm. I guess to your point, Caryn, about how advocates in the field are working with one another, or sometimes working at odds with one another. And I'll recall again the recent panel we did where Jim Strong from the Steelworkers was sitting next to me. He made the comment that, you know, minimum wage jobs were jobs for children. Those jobs were not intended to provide for people's families. And so we really have to think about this green economy in a way that reminds us that we need a density of union jobs so that we are not only protecting the climate, but people can work so they are not abusing the climate. When you don't have anything, it's so much easier to, use cheaper paint, right? That may or may not have lead in it, or use materials that they found a way to put asbestos back in it, or dump in a certain community because the community has been completely disconnected from the system because no one's working, right? And people, I think a lot of us misunderstand how good we have it because of the labor movement. And now are taken for granted and trying to be snazzy, hip, and, you know, fast moving, that, you know, renewable economy, and green jobs, but you have to fight for those jobs to be protected, or, you know, by the time the robots come, you both won't have a job, and the job you had wasn't paying for anything anyway.
So this is one of those issues where I go from wearing my JOTF hat to just taking it off and putting it back on, and I don't know at what point it happens. I just don't know.
Is it really a hat, or is it more like a fascinator?
Like shades.
Right? Looking over you. Like, what now? Okay.
So, okay. I'm going to start off with, when I think environmental justice, that's what I'm going to start off with. Environmental justice, because many times major projects in communities either start off with some type of environmental scan or analysis that must occur to ensure that the work that's going to occur won't, you know, jeopardize lives, right? And on the front end, while you're like, great, that's wonderful, I feel like it never really goes far enough to really talk about how it's going to impact certain lives who may be more susceptible to certain challenges, okay? Then on the other end, many times the environmental challenges or issues that result from these large development projects, if they are happening in communities where many times the residents aren't even working on the projects, or they're not going to benefit from it, the environmental hazard that comes from those projects aren't necessarily mitigated or even thought about in terms of mitigation through the project and then after.
Subsequently, right.
Okay. So I got that on one hand. Now, as I'm saying this, y'all, I told y'all I'm doing my JOTF shades and all of that, but I don't really know when they're coming on and off. The other piece of that is this, and I could be wrong, so I'm waiting for y'all to check me on it, because I don't have no facts to back this up except my own personal experience.
All right.
And it just comes to advocates in general. There's a frustration when we talk about environmentalism, environmental issues, and workforce, in the sense that there is a large disconnect in terms of many times our work is always discussed in silos. But when you talk about environmental issues, it tends to come off very abstract and very white. And if we are not connecting what I just mentioned in terms of environmental hazards and how, yes, there should even be an opportunity for us to think more creatively about the products that we're using, but also how we can access many of these jobs that are coming up around whether they be green or whatever, then we're doing a disservice to the communities that are going to be most impacted by it. And so I say that I, am conflicted and trying to figure this out because I don't know what the role of JOTF or even I will be in terms of this discussion, because of course you want to make sure that if there are jobs, folks can access those jobs. But I also want to make sure that certain issues and challenges are going to be identified and articulated for certain communities because it's not monolithic. Does that make sense? I told you I'm working through it.
Yeah, no,
and I think you saw some of that in her piece. You've seen that in some of our previous coverage, especially when we've done town halls, that a big theme throughout is how do you relate to everyday people to help them understand how this is really impacting them, because their communities, our communities, are the ones that face the biggest impact from environmental issues. So
yeah, it's a wild one. I'm becoming more and more interested in watching this topic because I feel like, especially from the more I'm watching Donna's story and the work she's doing, the more my mind is changing and forming. I'm like you, like I'm working through a lot of this stuff too, because it's all relative, it's all important, but then another one of those things that the political system is set up in a way where everyday people are not really seeing the urgency and actually figuring this thing out. You know what I mean? It's just like
And where I grapple with it is having to come to the admission I have to give something up.
Yeah.
And sometimes people will hear me say the black middle class is actually a thorn in my side when it comes to justice, because we feel like we made it. Right? And we don't have to give anything up. And what you mean I shouldn't be driving this Lexus truck? So that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And also kind of a convenient amnesia about how close we were to not having on a day-to-day basis, and
how close we are.
Let me bring my tense current, right? Because that was the one paycheck from R. Right?
There is not an achievement gap. Okay.
So, but yeah, just what do I need to give up, and how am I not using my voice, which is very powerful, to advocate in that space when ultimately, if we're flooded, or if the planet is underwater, who cares if kids have a school to go to, right?
One of my favorite things. One of my favorite things. One of the things I miss about being an organizer was getting everyday people to realize what their power was. I always say, I was an organizer for 10 years, and when I first started, they told me that the lifeline of an organizer was 2 to 3. They said you'll burn out and you'll get tired of this work in 2 to 3 years. And the 2 to 3 years came, and what I was not tired of was getting everyday people to just take the time to come out of your shell, come down to Annapolis, come down to City Hall, come knock doors with us, come and rally with us, come and write your legislator. Let me show you how to write your legislator. And then the conversation that people would have with me afterwards, like so rewarding.
Gratitude,
you know what I mean? To be like, I didn't know that I could do this.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like this, like the whole structure is set up in a way that it looks like this big, scary machine with these big, scary people in their fancy suits that, you know what I mean, are controlling and in charge of everything. When in all actuality, these are your employees. You pay taxes that pay these people's salaries. You know what I mean? I remember once an elected official got very upset because I had organized an event that it was supposed to be about raising awareness around healthcare and the healthcare crisis. And because it was a few days before an election, it turned into this political rally.
It happens.
All these candidates came. And so I go to my good friend Heber Brown. Shout out to Heber Brown III.
Yeah.
And I say, Heber, I need you, you're going to do this prayer. I need you to open this prayer up, and I need you to, like, if you can, make it very clear that this is not about them and their campaigns. And Heber went up there and he called them servants.
Ooh.
And if you could see the look on Martin O'Malley's face, the audacity to be called a servant, and the things he said afterwards behind, you know what I mean, behind closed doors about the pastor and about our rally, it was just indicative that, this thing is set up in a way where they want you to think that they are the ones in charge. And essentially they are, because they're making the decisions, they're passing the bills. But at the end of the day, if we can get more and more people to understand that, you may be an employee, but you also have employees. That people that you're paying every month, that the money is coming out of your check to do what they're supposed to do.
You go to the store.
Yeah, I don't really understand. Like, I don't even give it a second thought. Like, when it comes to, like, my interactions with the legislators. You are a person who were elected. And so I have an expectation of you because
100%.
that is what you led me to believe.
Yeah, that's what you campaigned on.
And so when you don't meet those expectations,
don't be surprised.
Don't be surprised at how I then respond. Okay,
I mean, it's a smokescreen.
I don't work for you.
It's a smokescreen, and the fundamental question here is who has a right to this city. And if you are constantly fed that it's their city and not your city, then of course you're not going to ask questions.
And what's up with the rhetoric from some candidates? Some of them won their primary. And some of them, have been in the legislature for not very long, but, they represent certain areas of the city. And it's this rhetoric of, we've got to take our city back.
Yeah, who took it?
Last I checked, you have an office in Annapolis already.
Come on now.
And last I checked, in terms of numbers, you're less than.
Come on now.
I mean, I know how majority minority numbers work. So,
from whom are you taking the city back?
And what you want to do with it?
Well, there's that. Okay.
Well, we thank you for tuning in.
This was fun.
This was wonderful.
Caryn, when we have you back, perhaps we will talk child support, but we're going to turn up with some other topics. We're going to be like, we got to have a dance party in here.
Caryn, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Caryn York, Executive Director of the Job Opportunities Task Force. Always working hard, always so awesome. Thank you so much for coming
Always bringing that Black girl magic.
Always, yes.
I love it.
Thank you all, the viewers. We cannot do this without you. We are a nonprofit organization where you do not take corporate funding or any advertisement. We are supported totally by you, and we try to bring you the real, what you want. So if you have already donated, we want to thank you, thank you, thank you. If you have not had an opportunity to donate, please do. Please go to therealnews.com, click that donate button, and give to us so that we can continue to have these type of shows, type of discussions, and give you these types of stories. Feel free to write us with any feedback. The Baltimore Bureau podcast show actually came out of suggestions from Baltimore residents who wanted to have a podcast show where we did all of the Baltimore stories that we had that week. So here we are giving this to you. So we are open to all of your suggestions. I want to thank everybody behind the scenes who makes this happen. Shout out to my man Stephen Frank back there, Dwayne Gladden on the visuals.
That one.
David Hebden, who makes sure that this is up on the podcast and it all sounds great. Shout out to Jocelyn Dombrowski, who always takes our photos. Am I missing anyone?
Not this week.
Not this week. Good. I think I did it.
Yeah.
I did it. As always, every week we close with some Baltimore music. I wanna remind you that the Whole Bushel is coming up on October 24th. Check out Baltimore Magazine this week. There's an article online about the Whole Bushel. Shout out to Lauren Cohen for doing that. One of the guests that I've had on the Whole Bushel, TT the Artist, is the creator of this song that we're going to close out with. This is TT the Artist featuring Stars, Payroll, and we will see y'all next time. Thanks again.
Just got paid Friday night.
Boy, I love you. I be lying. Payroll, get the paper all the time. I just tell you that so you can rack it up. You just tell me that because you just trying to fuck. Boy, I love you. I be lying. Payroll, get the paper all the time. I just tell you that so you can rack it up. You just tell me that because you just trying to fuck.
Birkin be the letters where the purse is, ayy. Pictures no filter cause you're perfect, ayy. Shake it for me, mama, it's your birthday, ayy. Stunting on these bitches cause they lurking, ayy. Booty's getting big, but you getting bigger. Do it on your own cause you don't need no nigga. Bet she want the D, I might just slang it to her. Ride my pony, if she like it, I might sing it to her. When shorty on the block, then the block hot. In the hood with the dealers at the dope spots. Spent some money on the girl and I ain't seen it since. I call her phone every day and then she tell me this. Boy, I love